Hello again, everyone. So I know I end up having a lot of questions with my different videos, and I do intend to get to all of them eventually and answer them. Some of them are a little too complicated to answer with text on the actual comment on the video. So what I try to do is make response videos to answer the questions. And I know I kind of have a backlog with this, but the last video I did talking about different uses of the word fairy in modern terms in academia and different demographics, I had a question on that video, which I think I can do a fairly short video answer for. So I want to do that one first, and then I promise I will get to the other questions and answers hopefully soon. However, that all said, the question on the last video related to how other similar terms are used in, I assume, both modern terms and modern times and academia and folklore and such. So the last video, I was looking at the word fairy, and this specific question touched on the words fae, changeling, fair folk, similar words to that. And it is a very good question and pretty topical to the last video, so I wanted to get into that here. Now, I want to start off by saying that we are pretty much sticking to English language terms in this video. I'm going to be touching a tiny bit on French because it's pertinent, but just be aware that these are specific to English language usage. If we wanted to look at terms in other languages, there are similar or equivalent terms, say in like Irish or Welsh or Scottish Gaelic, but that would make for a very complicated video. And I'm not sure how much interest there would be in it, really, because the majority of those terms, as they're being used in the living language-speaking cultures, people are already pretty aware of what they mean. And outside of those cultures, for the most part, they don't get used. Although I probably will end up eventually following this video up with one touching on the usage, particularly of Irish language terms around fairies, and how those are popping up in pop culture and more mainstream areas, and how that's a good thing and also can be and is really problematic. That is a separate video though. Today's video, we're going to be sticking mostly to English. And before we get into the specific terms themselves, I do want to just quickly mention that in all of this, in the English language material, honestly in any language material, but for our purpose today, specifically the English language material, spelling is inconsequential. The reason for that is that up until fairly recently, I want to say maybe the last 100 years, spelling was non-standardized, which means that there really wasn't a particular accepted form for a lot of words. It just came down to how an author or someone writing a piece wanted to write that particular word. So, for example, if you read the book, The Good Folk, New Fairy Lore Essays, which came out in 1991, there's an article in that, it's the anthology, there's an article in that specifically takes on sort of untangling everything to do with the word fairy, and it lists something in the area of 100 different spellings for the word fairy that can be found across the written material that we have. And I am not exaggerating, that is not hyperbole, it's literally 100 something. The reason for this, as I said, is because whoever was writing it would just spell it however they felt it made sense to spell it. So you might see fairy F-A-I-R-Y, which is sort of the modern accepted academic spelling, if you will. You might see it F-A-E-R-I-E, which tends to be a little more common in my experience in the modern pagan communities. You will also find that historically, that spelling. You will see some really interesting spellings from a modern American English spelling perspective. F-F-E-R-R-I-E, for example. P-H-E-E-R-I-E. Really just any combination of letters that could potentially make the sounds that we would associate with the word fairy, which of course the pronunciation has changed since it entered the English language in the 13th and 14th centuries. But for our purposes, just any combination you can think of, PH, F, double F, lots of different vowels show up. Some of them are really festive. So, and I mention this really because you will see people trying to argue that the different spellings were indicative of something, that if it was spelled one particular way, that indicated a particular type of being, but if it was spelled different way, that meant something else, that one spelling might mean the sort of fictitious, fantastical fairies, but another spelling meant the older folkloric. No. Possibly there are some modern communities that have chosen to use specific spellings to indicate certain things. That would be very community specific. Across the breadth of the material, across the entire time period that we're looking at, and across the academic written material that I have access to, that is simply not true. They're just various spellings that you will find. They really don't indicate anything in particular. And that is true not only for the word fairy, that is also true for the related terms that we're going to be discussing, particularly fae. So, that all said, I have already done the video on fairy. I've actually done a couple videos on the word fairy now. I don't want to get too much back into that. We'll just quickly touch on the fact that it came into English in the 13th century from the 12th century French. It did originate in French. The English language really, really loves to sort of mug other languages in dark alleys and then take the vocabulary that it finds there and make it its own. So it came into English from French. In French, originally in the 12th century, it indicated a place or was used as an adjective to indicate things associated with that place or that concept. It came into English, and then around the 14th century in English, it came to be associated with that type of being. So as opposed to being an adjective where you might see references to, for example, like a fairy woman, where it was a woman who had fairy-like qualities or a woman from the land of fairy, we then start to just see things being referred to as fairies. If that all makes sense to everyone. Quickly recapping fairy. Again, please check out the previous videos if you want the deep dive into all of this. But the reason I mention this and the reason that this is important is because the first word that the question touched on was the word fae. Fae means fairy. It's a synonym to the word fairy. It comes into English, much like the word fairy itself, from the French. It is seen in 12th century French in particular. It's actually the root of the English word fairy. But it also was sort of incorporated into English as the word fae. The modern French word, let me see if I can do this here on the screen. The modern French word for fairy, if my camera focus will cooperate here, is the word fée. And of course my camera doesn't want to focus, but it's F-E with a diacritical mark. I'm sorry, I don't know what the name of that particular accent mark in French is. F-E with an accent mark, E, is the modern French word, fée, which is from the older French word root fée. So, and it means fairy. Fée in modern French means fairy. Fée in Old French meant fairy. And in Old English meant fairy. I'm not trying to overly emphasize this. I just want to be clear. There is another word in English, which is a homonym, also the word fae, but it has a different meaning, it has a different root. It comes from a more Norse background, and it means fated to die, or sort of wild, out of control, ecstatic. Those two do sometimes get confused, but they are separate words and they are synonyms, or homonyms. Sorry, homonyms, not synonyms. The word fey from the Norse root is usually spelled F-E-Y. The word fey from the French is usually spelled F-A-E. However, remember what I said about spelling earlier, you will find fey meaning fairy spelled in various ways, including F-E-Y, because it would just be too simple and straightforward if we didn't have that level of confusion going on. So, fae is basically just a synonym for the word fairy. We see its usage throughout the English language, period. From the 14th century pretty much onwards, just meaning a fairy. It has gained some popularity again recently. So I'm seeing more people using the term fae. It's interesting, I suppose. I'll note that in some demographics that are using the word fairy to mean a very specific type of being, they're using the word fae to mean the more general, all things otherworldly. I personally find this extremely confusing because the words are synonyms, but it does indicate an evolution of the definitions of the terms in those communities. Just something to be aware of. Some people do use the words that way. In most folklore, in most academic material, they're just treated as synonyms. It's not uncommon, and I should point out that the idea that fairy and fae mean basically the same thing, indicate the same type of being. Up until very, very recently, fairy was a generic term, and it was synonymous with a lot of other generic terms. Elf, which was also used as a generic term for otherworldly beings. Goblin, slightly more specific in a lot of contexts, but it was used synonymously with fairy and elf in quite a few written sources. Sometimes even incubus would be used synonymously with all of these. So these are all very non-specific terms, and when you run across them in the older material, in the older folkloric accounts, older poems, Chaucer, pretty much any of the Scottish material written in English, or Scots even, you're going to see these all used very, very interchangeably, and clearly all referring to the same general sort of thing. So sort of the issues that we had with fairy in the last video also apply to all of this as well. Just something to keep in mind. I could have touched on the word elf and all this. I didn't because it wasn't part of the original question, but sort of these same concepts apply there. It was originally a very general term. It's actually used sort of adjectively. Alaric Hall has a really good book, Elves in Anglo-Saxon England, I believe it's called, that gets into some of the different linguistic uses of the term elf. Elf, I should say. Mixing up my Germanic and my Anglo-Saxon Old English there, but he gets really into how the term was used, how the word was used, and we do see elf applied in that generic sense. So we see references like mountain elves and river elves and, all sorts of things that make it clear that they weren't really viewed as a specific, unique sort of thing so much as a sort of general type of thing. It's the same with fairy, it's the same with fae. So, that's kind of getting into the word fae. You will see people today using the term fae folk. fairy folk, basically. Perfectly legitimate word usage, as it were. Which gets us into the next term. The next part of the question was the word changeling. So, I have done a couple longer videos about changelings. I don't want to rehash all of that material here. In English, the term changeling entered common vernacular, or at least written sources, right about the middle of the 16th century. I think 1560 is the oldest recorded mention of it. A changeling is a fairy or inanimate object that has been disguised with magic to look like a living human that the fairies have stolen away for assorted reasons. There's quite a lot of changeling lore out there in Celtic language-speaking cultures and in adjacent cultures, including Norse and Germanic. And usually with this material, we see the idea that fairies are prone to kidnapping or stealing humans, particularly babies and young children, sometimes also brides, sometimes also just more generally young adults, male or female, or miscellaneous. They have their own motivations for doing this. I don't want to get into all of that in this video, but it's a pretty well-established pattern that fairies will take people. Sometimes when they take the people, the other humans will just think that person has died. That's a separate thing. But in other cases, what happens is the fairies will leave behind either one of their own number disguised as the human, or an inanimate object, usually a log or a stick, something along those lines, that has been magically disguised as the living person that's been taken. And generally in the stories, it is at some point discovered, and sometimes the living human is rescued or brought back. Sometimes, probably more of the time, not. Changeling lore has quite a dark history to it. There are multiple recorded accounts of people, particularly children, but also adults, who were killed by other people, other humans, who thought that that person was a changeling, who thought that that person had been taken by the fairies and was trying to basically torture the alleged changeling in order to force the fairies to bring the real human back. And what ends up happening, obviously, is that the actual human who was there the whole time is killed. And there's some very, very sad examples of that we have, particularly with children, although not exclusively. So when we're talking about changelings, it's got a lot of layers of meaning to it, but ultimately it's the idea of a being that has been changed out for something else, a human that has been changed out for something else. Now, I know in modern terms, in modern communities in some places, particularly communities in my experience that do not have a deep understanding or a strong connection to the older fairy folklore, there can sometimes be a tendency or a habit of using changeling as sort of a term of endearment. I've seen people refer to their own children as a changeling. I mean, it's not totally uncommon across history to see different terms originally applied to fairies then applied to humans, usually in a pejorative sense. For example, the word fairy itself in the 17th century came to be applied to women who were thought to have loose morals. And then later in the 18th and 19th centuries to homosexual men, not originally intended in a flattering sense. So it's not unheard of for a term related to beings of fairy or the other world to shift and be applied to human beings. It's usually not really a flattering thing. Although, of course, the word fairy itself in some places is sometimes applied to children as sort of a cute little fairy, kind of leaning into the flower fairy ideas. But I have seen people referring to their children in that way as a term of endearment. Clearly, they are not trying to imply that the child is not actually their child, but is a fairy, and that their real child was stolen away into the other world and is enslaved or an appetizer or whatever other fate could potentially be going on with their real child. Yeah, I'm not really sure what the positive side of that reference is, but I have seen people using it, so I'm sure that they have some positive association with it. I want to mention it here because we're getting into the linguistic and the uses of the words. Usually, calling someone a changeling is not a super positive thing. It's got at least a little edge of pejorativeness to it. I will say, I had recently tried to look into what the term would be for a human who was rescued from the fairies, because we do have some folklore around that, anecdotal accounts around that. And among my friends, particularly in Ireland, the general consensus seemed to be that you would call those people changelings as well, sort of because they had been changed out and then brought back. So, there is that angle to it. Generally, people who were taken by the fairies and recovered when that did occur were then seen to be a little strange or off or odd. The term away with the fairies, referencing people who were thought to at least spend part of their time with the fairies. Again, not usually meant in a flattering sense. But either way, that is sort of everything to do with the word changeling. There is, of course, also a role-playing game called Changeling, which has a very different viewpoint and approach to the word and to folklore and to all of these concepts. I will say I am a fan of Changeling as a role-playing game, but the folklore in it does tend to be very divergent from actual traditional cultural folklore. I'll just say that. Doesn't make it any less fun to play, doesn't make it any less interesting. It's just important to note that the material that they portray in the game is meant for a game. It's plot points. It's meant to further playing the game, not to reflect genuine cultural folklore. Just something to keep in mind. So beyond that, the final part of the question was touching on terms like fair folk. That's a euphemism, pretty straightforward. The idea was that you did not actually want to call fairies fairies, that they could be passing invisibly at any point. If they heard you calling them fairies, they did not like that word. It was offensive to them. They might get angry, they might cause you harm or bad luck or do who knows what. So instead of calling them fairies, you would want to use a term that they would find more pleasing. And there's a whole wide array of these. There's a selection of Welsh, there's a selection of Irish, Scottish, but for our purposes in our little English-focused video here, we have fair folk, we have the gentry, noble people, silent people, people of peace, shining ones, mother's blessing, other crowd, other folk, good folk. I could keep going. There's quite a list of them. And the point with all of these, fair folk inclusive, is just to use a term for them that they would not find offensive, that they might even consider a little flattering, or that might, remind them of potentially their better nature. So if they were passing you by and they heard you talking about the fair folk, it might remind them to maybe be fair in any sense of that word. The same with gentry, shining ones, people of peace, etc. So The use of euphemisms, very widespread across Celtic language-speaking countries, and really just another way, again, to refer to fairies. So fairies, fae, fair folk, shining ones, etc., all really synonymous terms. They all mean basically the same thing, a being of the otherworld. Changeling is a little more specific in that it's referring to a being of the otherworld or a magically disguised object that has been switched out for a living human who has been kidnapped. Or possibly referring to a human who was kidnapped and then rescued. But either way, that one is slightly different in this context. Fairies that were used as changelings tended to either be very, very old fairies, if such a thing falls into your belief system, or potentially fairy infants that were weak and not likely to survive, sort of being pawned off on human parents, while the healthy, robust human baby was taken. In the case of stolen brides in particular, it was usually a glamoured object, like a stick or a log that was left behind, as opposed to an actual fairy. In the case of infants, the changeling infant would usually die after a period of time, leaving the human parents to mourn. And of course, there's a variety of different folklore and anecdotes around this. I'm just kind of going with the most common. Or in some cases could be rescued, usually by tricking the changeling to reveal its true nature. Or, as I mentioned, talking about the darker aspect of changeling lore, by treating it so badly that the fairies came and took it back and then left the real infant or child in its place. Don't really recommend personally doing that, but there you go. So that's a quick look at some of these other English language terms for fairies, sort of their history, how long we've been using them, and all of that fun stuff. So video did go a little longer than I intended, but I hope it was educational and useful for everyone. And I will at some point in the future do a video about some of the Irish language terms, particularly ones kind of working into pop culture. And I will try to get to the other questions on my other videos. I know there's been a couple hanging around out there for a few months. It's just been really busy. So I hope everyone has a great day, and I will see you again soon.